one of the first questions we had in the session. I think this is really important around validating the modelling. So people often do question modelling. So one of the first questions we had there was actually from Andrew Smith, asking Richard about the growth rates results that he was presenting, on whether they were from local trials or from modelled projections. So can I just ask, Rich, can you just comment on, on the modelling that has occurred in terms of how that has been validated through other more localised research on the ground trials? Pete has commented there that it does has supported what he has found, I know, at James Neal's place. I'll just pass it over to you just to comment briefly on that supported evidence on the ground.
Yeah, thanks, Marguerite. That's often asked as a question, and we had Andrew Smith, not the same one who asked the question. Andrew Smith worked with us on that and worked extensively with Peter and with other data sets on the New South Wales coast. And the first thing we do with our modelling is make sure it's representing some form of reality. Obviously, what you'll find with modelling is a difference between the kind of data it produces compared to what Dave was showing. Dave showed you all the natural variability you're going to get. So you've got all these points on the screen showing you the highs and lows, and that's the real world. Modelling doesn't give you that variability. It tries to say, well, what would have happened on average given a fixed set of conditions? So we spent a fair bit of time calibrating our model to the data sets that Peter was able to provide to make sure they were representing what really happens in those circumstances. You can't always completely repeat it. So for example, on Oxley, for example, it's got a saline subsoil down at depth. Well, the model struggles to figure out what happens to kikuyu roots down there. But we were able to get around that as well. So I think what the models are useful to do is to challenge the difference between one scenario and another scenario. I would never actually, if the model said 10, I wouldn't believe 10. I'd say if the model said there was a 10% difference between A and B, I'd say, well, that I can bank. So it's the relative differences that you get out of modeling that I think is useful, not the absolute data. I don't know if that's too much of an answer or...
No, thanks, Rich. I think that's really important because we do need to try and, I guess, build more confidence around modelling because it certainly answers questions, I guess, more efficiently, and we can find answers more readily across a number of scenarios through this method. On-ground trials are rare and very expensive to run, so it is an important method that we have confidence.
I'd probably add that, there's no way we would have got funding to run a 20-year grazing experiment at multiple locations across the country. So it kind of is the only way to do it, to say, well, how does northern New South Wales differ from southern New South Wales, from Tasmania, from South Australia, and do the best practices that actually hold true across all those locations?
Absolutely. And I think that Bill's comment there about that the modelling shows trends that make you think about the whole system is a really important point to be made. So look, I get there was a very quick question that Neil Griffiths had, and Neil, I would love for you to actually turn on your camera if you're able to. Someone with a wealth of knowledge in our farming systems around this part of the world. I'm not sure he's willing to, but Neil actually asked the question, can you talk more about the nitrogen rates and grazing management? So I guess that the weighing up in of grazing at that 3 leaf stage versus potentially 2.5 and finding that right balance.
Who's that directed to?
We can throw that at either of you. There's Neil.
Morning, looking at my best. Yeah, look, to both of you, I guess the question is around with the trial work and the modelling. I'm assuming it's working on optimum grazing management, But what happens if you getting good growth, you go over your 3 leaves, or conversely, I think Dave, you said something about one of yours where there was low growth because they were grazing too early. So decisions around this end versus when we're grazing and when things all link up together and when things go wrong.
Yeah. So I think the last slide of grass I presented there was actually, basically on field, on paddock, where, it was during that, even though it's irrigated, it was during that pretty dry period last year, and the farmer just didn't have enough feed, and so he's moving around, every sort of 2 weeks rather than every 3 weeks. And so he couldn't get to that sort of 3-leaf growth stage. And that's why we sort of see those lower nitrogen responses, because the plants just didn't quite have enough time to utilize it. But, that's the real world scenario in that particular case. I mean, there's also other issues there around, not very good use of the nitrogen. Certainly we just kept on putting it on and there's no response. So those sort of scenarios, can happen. When you go too late, I suppose it's just a matter of, as you sort of start to decline in your productivity as you go over the 3-leaf stage. But probably Rich is better at answering that.
I'll follow on from where Dave left off. Often the grazing management is sometimes a deliberate compromise around what we know is ideal. And we know 3-leaf expression is meant to be the best combination of protein to energy, because you've got maximum leaf area, you've captured the most photosynthesis, your ME is going to peak at 3-leaf in ryegrass. But what Dave says is right. If you deliberately go in with in the peak of spring, if you wait for annual rye to get to 3-leaf, you might be looking at a massive amount of yield and lodging and problems like that. So you have this deliberate compromise, but you've got to remember what you've done. If you go in at, say, 2-leaf into annual rye, you fertilize with 50 kilos of N in spring, you've got a large amount of nitrate still sitting in the leaf. And so you are grazing a plant that's high in nitrate, and the cow's not very efficient at using it. It's going to excrete a lot of that in urine. So that's where you get the heavy urinary excretion of nitrogen. But sometimes it's a deliberate compromise. If you go over 3-leaf, well, you know that you've dropped the ME from the ideal to something slightly less than ideal, but you've probably got as much crude protein as you're ever going to get out of that response to nitrogen. So again, the energy required to metabolize the surplus nitrogen might be limited by going over 3-leaf. But I think in the real world, we'd love to see everyone graze at 3-leaf, but that's not the real world. I think we have to make deliberate compromises around it to manage the grass.
Okay, thanks, Rich, and thanks for that, Neil. Look, I've got a question here from Josh Hack, again, another advisor that we have in our region. Josh, could you please turn on your camera, if you're willing, to ask your question around seasonal marginal response and looking at, the lowest amount in which we're actually seeing that response.
Yeah, sure. So there's a couple of slides you put up there of the seasonal response. I'm just asking a question around, like it's showing the screen. I don't know if you can put it up or not, but it's the one with the irrigated kikuyu seasonal response to N, and then the ryegrass one as well. But down the bottom it says summer. Down the bottom it says summer. Where is it?
This one?
Let's just double check. I'm actually looking on my screen. I took photos of it. No, go back one. A couple more. Yeah, I think that's it there. Yeah. Yep. So that's irrigated kikuyu, that one. In summer. So we're suggesting that, and the question was, what's the lowest rate? So it looks like it's between 0 and 50 somewhere. Is that?
It should be 0 is the lowest rate.
Okay.
It might just appear that way on grass, but it.
Yep. No, that's okay.
Sorry, it might be. I think it's probably the 20 kgs of DAP we put on at the beginning. Sorry, I'll sort of. Yeah, so it'd be about 20 just from the initial starter we put on at the beginning.
Yep. And this is the seasonal application of total N across just the summer or the year?
That's just over the summer.
Yep. Fantastic. So what we're actually saying there is it's pointless putting any nitrogen on. Is that correct? Marginal response? Have I got that wrong? The bottom right-hand corner.
The marginal response is just how much response you get from every additional kilogram of nitrogen. So you're still seeing a response. It's just declining. So we get a lot more after the first 20 than we do after the second 20. But we're still seeing it. It's still increasing. So
I would say in some years, and it might be just because this is modeled, I don't know where the starters come from, but in some years we actually see the opposite. Sometimes if you put 20 kilos of N out, you don't see the response. If you've got high organic matter and whatever. But then you get to the 30, 40 kilos, the next rotation or whatever, then you get a response.
Yeah.
That's just interesting that's actually saying, the less.
Well, that's extremely true, and that's extremely important to realise because this is following straight on from fertilised ryegrass. So it's been fertilised all the year through. If you're in a beef pasture, and this is the issue the beef guys have, is that they won't often see a response until 50, 70 kilos, because you have so much sort of high carbon organic matter sitting there that as soon as they get some nitrogen on it, the bugs just go and suck it all up.
Yes.
So you get a lot of immobilisation. It will come out later. It'll just be a trickle that comes out. You just won't really see a big response. So if you haven't fertilised your pastures for a while, particularly kikuyu, you've got a big, thick carbon-rich mat there, then you will have a fair bit of immobilisation, and you will need a bigger kick at the beginning to try and actually see a response.
Yeah, and we see that too, I guess, in the summer when we have those big 2, 3, 4, 500 mil rainfall events, and then the kike wants to kick away, and it's just very, very hungry. But that's good, thanks.
Yeah, just on that, Josh, we actually, strangely enough, we wrote an article about the penalty of not applying nitrogen to kikuyu through the summer period. And it was just answering some of the questions in kikuyu only systems. If you go through the spring period and you don't apply any nitrogen, you get to the summer period and you put on nitrogen expecting a response, and it actually all just goes into the organic matter. You kind of lose a application of nitrogen into that massive organic matter that's now high carbon, low nitrogen. And then the next rotation, you get a great response. So I reckon it does depend on the background nitrogen that's happening. So if you've got a high organic matter there, chances of getting a response to a low rate of nitrogen is low. Because there's so much coming out of the soil.
Yeah, and that depends on your soil type as well. So on your sandy or duplex soils, you're going to see a response at less nitrogen rates, but those alluvial clays can suck up a lot of nitrogen.
I guess it also depends, Dave, if your irrigated site here was on a free draining or sort of a alluvial draining soil, then the irrigation could have resulted in less soil nitrogen available.
It's a heavy black vertisoil, so not very well drained.
Should have held on to the nitrogen. Yeah.
It holds on to it, that's right. It doesn't lose it, but it immobilizes it. So it just basically takes it out of that first response. You'll still get it coming out later on. We still see the fertilizer coming out sort of 6 months down the track. It's just really a really slow release then, and often it's released during those big East Coast lows when you don't really want it released.
Can I ask one more question? I've asked this before, Richard, and I'm still haven't got it in my head, so I'm confused on it. But with kikuyu, if we have really good growing conditions, we can be hitting 4.5 leaf in 15 to 20 days. Even some guys are doing it at sort of that 12 to 16 days. With the nitrogen recommendation of, being that 18 to 23 days or whatever it is, because the kikuyu is growing at a high rate and it's diluting that nitrate through the leaves, is it still okay or safe to be grazing kikuyu at our 4 leaf stage at 15 or 20 days post grazing and post fertilizer, post nitrogen?
Two things there. One, I think it really depends on the time of the year. So if you're talking early season growth in kikuyu prior to sort of January, February, where that real bulk starts happening, then it's probably going to be higher in nitrate. Once you get into that January, February, March area where there's a lot of biomass produced, then the nitrate risk is pretty low. It's diluted very quickly. So again, it's the time of the year, you know, your early growth of kikuyu in the season is going to have higher nitrate. But you know, I don't know what the realistic risk is. I think if you're going in between 7 and 14 days, you probably have your highest nitrate. If you can wait through to 18 days, it drops pretty quickly after that. Between sort of day 14, day 12 and day 14 starts dropping off quite rapidly.
That's good. Thank you.
Okay, so thanks heaps for that input, Josh, and for the answers that Rich and Dave were able to provide. Just one here from Pete Bill asking, can we have a comment that our annual ryegrass has higher growth rates? So our N rate should be higher than Victorian recommendations.
I could probably, I don't know if Dave wants to comment, but yeah, look, one thing that surprised us with the modeling, and we actually went back and looked at what came out of it is, you know, if you've got a highly vigorous growing species like annual rye in the subtropics, in the late winter period, under almost ideal growth conditions, you know, it's going to be growing 140 kilos a day. And to maximize that growth rate, you are going to need a higher rate of nitrogen. And so from our modeling, it did suggest that you could be putting on 50, 60 kilos of N and getting your 90% of maximum out of that. We also, interestingly enough, found Utopia in northwest Tasmania in our modeling, where we actually found perennial ryegrass growing in northwest Tasmania in spring period under irrigated conditions. You could justify 60 kilos there because, you know, it grows at, you know, it's more temperature sensitive. Give it the ideal growing conditions, it was growing at 140 kilos a day in that scenario. And we got, I think, a 28-to-1 response to nitrogen in northwest Tasmania on perennial rye. Annual rye, I think in your region, if you've got all the right growing conditions, you'd get that 25 to 30-to-1 response.
Yeah, we certainly see, you know, it's so hungry for nitrogen that period. We're getting enough takes above, you know, almost 3 kilos a day. So yeah, huge amounts.
The bigger challenge is how do you utilize it? That's really, you know, so if you're going to do that, you need to know you need it, and you need to know how you're going to utilize it, whether it's deliberately putting it through to silage, or it's, you know, you've got the stocking density to handle that. Because the worst thing you can do is underutilize it then and then have wastage, because then your effective nitrogen response is lower.
Okay, look, just a quick one here from Pat Neal, and then we'll just sort of summarise a little bit, I think, with a question that Pete Bill has just posted. But will nitrogen help with rust in ryegrass? So this is more of a...
I can't answer that one, so I'll hand over to the expert there, Rich.
Go for it, Rich.
It is tricky. I can't say I know specifically. Peter might have some thinking on this, but you know, rust in ryegrass is about humidity, and I think it has got more to do with how you then utilize and keep the pasture open than it has to do with. So if you could make it worse with nitrogen. I've actually seen it better with nitrogen, but you could make it worse by undergrazing and having that canopy with a lot of humidity sitting in it with too much growth, and let it go through the 3-leaf, and you could make it worse.
Okay, so thanks.
I don't know, anyone else? I'm up for any thoughts on this, because I don't.
Neil popped his head in, so Neil, just take yourself off mute, and
Neil's got some thoughts.
As a contribution to make.
Yeah, look, probably as Pat was implying, that general observation is that rust is worse with low nitrogen. So the sort of, yeah, the motherhood was sort of high nitrogen, and the other thing that was always talked about was shorter grazing intervals, so the rust didn't develop. I think the guys on the North Coast used to talk about 14 days or something being, you know, helping to keep rust under control, not just in ryegrass, but rust generally. High nitrogen seems to help.
Yeah, higher nitrogen, you'd mean, it ends up with a more vigorous plant. That could help with rust. But grazing management would help very much because it keeps the humidity and the canopy down as well.
Grazing management is more important, I would say. Yeah.
Varieties help, obviously.
Yeah. So a lot of factors to consider and weigh up. Okay, look, let's wrap this up with a bit of relevance to what's happening in our region right at this moment. We've just had 10 to 15 millimetres and more in some regions, quite substantially more, on very dry soils. Is it worth fertilising now? Should we be applying nitrogen? And what would you say if we had another 100 millimetres coming from an east coast low?
So I suppose the dry period beforehand really, was it so dry that your growth rates and your potential N uptake had slowed down or ceased? Then in that case, I would say don't fertilise because, a couple of things. The previous nitrogen's probably going to still be there. Plus, you would have had a fair bit of, particularly coming into spring, warmer soil temperatures, a fair bit of mineralisation. And so these are the typical conditions we get where we see these high nitrates and nitrate poisoning in beef, is where you might only have a small bit of rain after a big long period. You get a bit of a flush of short green grass and really high nitrates in there. So I suppose that's the risk there. I mean, 10 to 15 millimetres is not a huge amount anyway for the plants to make a use of. If there's another 100 millimetres from East Coast low, then potentially yes, because first of all, the grass is probably has the potential to take it all up. You would have still had a bit of more of a flush of mineralisation, but that really depends on how much grass growth you got as well. So if you can still grow the grass, then it's probably worth it. Yeah. Having said that, we have seen, particularly in the more higher carbon, high nitrogen soils, that you probably you don't need to add a lot even after 100 millimetres after rain, a large dry period beforehand, simply because the mineralisation can supply it. But on the sandier soils where there's just less nitrogen there in the first place, then you probably would want to put some on.
Okay, thanks, Dave. Thanks for answering that. And Peter did drop off there for a bit, but he's come back on again. Rich, do you have anything further on that, or?
No, just support what Dave said. Just on the one thing the modelling project showed us is 10 to 15 millimetres on a dry soil, not enough to get a response to nitrogen.
Okay, all right.
You need deeper soil moisture to get a response to nitrogen. It's got to be sitting down in the root profile, and then it's worth putting on.
So it's this question around the right soil moisture again, in order to give that trigger. Okay, look, we better round things off. We're running a little bit over time. So many thanks again to both Dave and Richard for their contributions. Thank you to the Hunter Local Land Services for actually conducting this project in the first place, and also for the support from the More Profit from Nitrogen program, which is supported by the Australian Government's Rural R&D for Profit program. So thanks all again. We will see you back here in November. Everyone will be sent reminders again. So please keep those. If you have questions in between, don't hesitate to email them through to me, and we'll catch up with everyone in a month's time. Thanks again, everyone. Catch you soon.
Thanks, Margaret.
Thank you.